Thomas S. Kidd, in Chapter 5 of his book, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father, discusses George Whitefield's evangelical tour in America starting November 2, 1739 in Philadelphia. Kidd documents Whitefield's travels from Pennsylvania all the way south to Georgia. Kidd highlights George Whitefield's Calvinistic convictions, pointing out how Whitefield believed that salvation was entirely a work of God's grace. Furthermore, Thomas Kidd discusses Whitefield's preaching and the tremendous response. One issue that stands out in Kidd's book is the role that media played in Whitefield's grand tour of America. As Kidd states, by the late spring of 1739, American newspapers, including Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, were buzzing with reports of England's star pastor. Kidd tells of how Franklin was curious about George Whitefield, so he set up an experiment to determine how far Whitefield's voice would carry. From his calculations, Franklin believed that over 30,000 would be able to hear him at one time. Between 1740 and 1742, as Kidd notes, Franklin printed 43 books and pamphlets dealing with Whitefield in the evangelical movement because he believed that Whitefield was legitimate. Franklin was not the only one to promote Whitefield. The Virginia Gazette gave much attention to Whitefield's tour of America and celebrated his arrival to Williamsburg. Frank Lambert, in his article Peddler and Divinity, discusses how George Whitefield used the press to raise curiosity among the people, share the gospel, and promote revivals. Lambert points out how Whitefield grew in popularity because his sermons and journals were distributed in large numbers throughout the colonies. As Lambert states, most of the 14 colonial newspaper publishers played important roles in promoting Whitefield's revivals, advertising his writings, and soliciting contributions. Due to the press, Whitefield was able to reach people from various denominations with different occupations who were scattered throughout the 13 colonies. Newspapers, however, did not always offer a positive perspective on Whitefield's contributions. Thomas Kidd mentions an Anglican named Jonathan Arnold who was quick to go to the press, expressing criticism of Whitefield's doctrine and character. The Boston Evening Post and the New York Weekly Journal also expressed criticism toward Whitefield. Lisa Smith, professor of English at Pepperdine University, writes an interesting paper on newspaper editors' attitudes toward the Great Awakening. Smith points out that the Awakening was the first American event to command widespread opinionated comment in the press. According to Smith, arguments over Whitefield and his methods, lay preachers, church purity, antinomianism, and religious enthusiasm can be found in every newspaper during the 1740s. The use of media during the Great Awakening served as the foundation and starting point for extensive intercolonial messaging that would take place prior to, during, and following the American Revolution. Todd Andrlik and J. L. Bell, correspondents for the Boston Globe, note that media during that time period was significantly less than what we have today. There were 38 newspapers in the colonies in 1775. Each issue was about 4 pages long and published weekly. Colonists scattered in areas outside of the towns would typically have to wait for writers to deliver the latest issue. However, even with these limitations, Andrlik and Bell recognized that print was an effective way of spreading the colonial and European news. Just as news of Whitefield reached people from various areas, faiths, and classes through the press, so it was with news during America's independence and founding. Most significantly was the impact that the press had on the American Revolution. Philip M. Taylor, in Munitions of the Mind, A History of Propaganda, dedicates one chapter to discussing the use of media during the war and the role that propaganda played. Taylor explains that without an effective propaganda campaign to explain away setbacks and defeats and glorify victories, the idea that independence was an achievable goal might have remained confined to the members of Congress. Without the aid of the press, the publicly conscious architects of the United States of America might never have achieved their goals.